The second game was extremely tense and sharp. Like in the first game, Bronstein had initiative, but Botvinnik found hidden resources of active defense and managed to create counterplay, while Bronstein missed his opportunities. So Bronstein played white pieces and started with d4. Botvinnik played Grünfeld defense. d5, c takes d, knight takes d5, e4, knight takes c3, b takes c, c5, immediately attacking the center. And here, the natural move knight f3 lets black get very comfortable active counterplay by pinning this very important knight, which defends the pawn on d4 and exerts pressure on the center. That's why, instead of knight f3, white started to play in 1930s bishop c4 in order to develop the knight on e2. And now bishop g4, of course, doesn't give anything to black because white can just play f3 and the knight isn't pinned. So bishop c4, bishop g7, knight e2, castles, and instead of the more popular move knight c6, exerting pressure on the center, Botvinnik played knight d7 because Bronstein was very good at this variation. Together with Boleslavsky, they analyzed this position after knight c6 a lot. And knight d7, a less active move, but less familiar for Bronstein too. That's what Botvinnik thought. But actually, Bronstein analyzed this position too after knight d7. Botvinnik expected more natural move, bishop e3, in order to defend the pawn and develop the bishop. However, Bronstein played bishop g5. That was absolutely unexpected for Botvinnik, and he spent 40 minutes thinking over his next move. Bishop g5 is pinning the pawn because it's very important, because black usually plays e5 in order to counterattack white's center, and now it's impossible, and the queen cannot move to c7, what black usually does in Grünfeld defense, because the queen must defend the pawn on e7. At first sight, black can play queen c7, sacrificing the pawn, because after bishop e7, rook e8, and retreat of the bishop, black can return the pawn by capturing on e4. However, it doesn't work because white doesn't retreat the bishop and plays d5. And it turns out that rook e7 is losing after d6 fork. So that's why Botvinnik was forced to play h6. And now bishop returns to e3. And we can see the difference between immediate bishop e3 and bishop g5 provoking h6 and then bishop e3. Now that the pawn is on h6, it doesn't defend g6 pawn anymore. And it's very important because f7 pawn is pinned. And now, by playing knight f4, white would threaten to capture on g6 because the pawn won't be able to capture it back. Queen c7. With x-ray, and black is threatening to capture on d4 and then capture the bishop. That's why rook c1, defending the bishop. So after c takes d, the bishop would be defended by rook. And a6. Here Bronstein made a natural move, positional move, queen d2, with tempo, developing the queen and threatening to capture on h6. However, Bronstein writes that it would be much better to play knight f4. Threatening to capture g6, and also knight d5 would be unpleasant with tempo centralizing the knight. For example, if b5, Bronstein gives the following variation: bishop d5 attacking the rook, and if bishop b7, then just knight takes g6. The knight is untouchable, and if bishop takes d5, then just knight takes e7 check, and then knight would capture on d5 with a winning position. Or if after b5, instead of b5, if black plays e6, then white can just sacrifice a piece and get a better position after this. But Bronstein missed this opportunity. Instead of knight f4, he played a natural-looking move, queen d2. However, white is still better. White has initiative, attacking h6, so king h7, and now bishop d3, as the king is on h7, so it makes sense to create this unpleasant x-ray. b5, and now Bronstein plays knight f4. And in his annotations he writes that, as it often happens, the move that was good in the previous move is bad the next move. so it's too late. It was better to play e5, opening the bishop's diagonal, and that would be more unpleasant for black. Botvinnik gives the following variation: knight b6, knight f4, bishop b7, knight h5, the pawn is pinned of course, and the knight is threatening to capture on g7, after which h6 would fall. And Botvinnik gives the following variation: rook h8, and after knight takes g7, king takes g7, h6 is defended, and Botvinnik calls this position defensible. However, instead of e5, Bronstein played knight f4. And now, in order to prevent e5, because white can still play e5, Botvinnik plays e5 himself, blocking the e-pawn. Now e5 is impossible. And in his annotations, Botvinnik writes that as Bronstein was very strong in attacking the king, it made sense to shift the weight of the struggle to the center and the queen side instead of the king side. And Bronstein, in his annotations, writes praises Botvinnik for his good understanding of psychology in chess. So e5. Now white doesn't have the attack on the king, but white still is better. Knight d5 attacking the queen, queen d6, and d takes c. At first sight, this move damages, completely ruins the pawn structure, and it's unnatural. However, Botvinnik gives this move an exclamation mark, as this move makes the bishop on g7 very bad, as the pawn on e5 would stay now forever, because before d takes c, black could have exchanged on d4, and the bishop had chances to become very active. And now, after d takes c, although the pawn structure is ruined, the bishop is very bad. It will stay bad till the end of the game. Knight takes c5. And although the knight is attacking the bishop isn't very good anymore. And without losing tempo, Bronstein immediately plays c4. He doesn't mind exchanging the bishop for the knight, as the knight is very good and the bishop isn't so good. And after c4, he can get rid of his isolated pawn and also open the c file. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, rook d8. Here, Bronstein had an opportunity to play, instead of c5, what he played, to make a stronger move, bishop b6, attacking the rook. And Botvinnik, for example, gives the following variation: rook d7, and only now c5, attacking the queen, queen c6, blocking the pawn, and queen e3, moving away from the x-ray, and f5, f3, rook f7, bishop a5, f takes, bishop e6. This is Botvinnik's variation. Although white is better, black has his own chances, as e4 is weak and the bishop isn't taking part currently in the active play on the queen side and in the center. But Bronstein, in his turn, writes that he didn't play bishop b6 because of queen takes b6. And after knight takes b6, rook takes d3, knight takes a8, b takes c, rook takes c4, bishop e6, he didn't see a simple move, rook a4, which would defend the pawn on a2. That's why he didn't play bishop a6. So, Bronstein played c5 immediately. Queen c6, blocking the pawn, rook d1, bishop e6, rook d2. So now white is doubling on the d file. Black do the same, rook d1, and a5. So white is exerting pressure and is threatening to do it further and to create threats. That's why black cannot just sit and wait. Black must create counterplay, and that's exactly what Botvinnik did. He has pawn majority on the queen side, so he is creating a passed pawn on the queen side. a3, rook d8, queen b3. Queen is moving away from this d file where black has doubled the rooks, rook b8, and f3. So white wants to play knight b6. in order to do it, first he played f3 in order to reinforce the pawn so that the queen cannot take it. And after rook b7, he played queen b2, moving away the queen from this diagonal so that the knight can move and block after b4, knight b6. The knight is blocking the b file, and now b4 pawn is under attack. And also, white is threatening to play rook d6, which would be very unpleasant. However, Botvinnik finds a great defensive resource. He plays bishop f8, defending from both threats. Now rook d6 is impossible. And after a takes, queen takes b4 would be a terrible blunder because of rook takes b6, and the pawn is pinned now. So that was another idea behind rook f8. Rook f8 also leaves the pawn unguarded, but it would be very dangerous to capture this pawn because after this the bishop would be able to return to g7 and would turn into a monster. And if we consider that black has a passed pawn on the queen side, then this pawn, supported by both bishops on g7 and e6, would have been very dangerous. That's why it's very dangerous to accept the sacrifice of the pawn on e5. And Bronstein, after a takes b, played just rook c1. And now Botvinnik has a tempo and he plays b3. Now he has a dangerous pawn on passed pawn on b3. Knight d5, blocking the bishop's diagonal so that it doesn't defend the pawn anymore. Bishop g7, rook d3. So white is threatening to play rook c3, and both rooks would be on the third rank, and just to capture this dangerous passed pawn. Rook b5, and as rook c3 doesn't work now, if white plays rook c3, then bishop f8, and rook b3 doesn't work because of rook b3, rook b3, rook b3, queen b3, and bishop takes c5. And the position is equal, and queen c3 pinning the bishop and threatening to capture on c5 doesn't work because bishop takes e3 check is a check. So that's why before playing rook c3 and capturing the pawn on b3, it makes sense to move the king to ensure the king's safety, and for this purpose Bronstein plays h4 in order to move the king on h2, and only then play rook c3 and capture the pawn on b3. However, h4 seriously weakens the king side, and both Bronstein and Botvinnik agree that it would be much better for the same purpose instead of h4 to play h3, and we will see the difference very soon. So rook b7, king h2, and now that white is threatening to play rook c3 and just capture a pawn, black again must create counterplay, because otherwise white will just gradually get an extra pawn and win. And the only way of counterattack is f5 to create weakness on f4, on e4. Rook c3, f takes e, and now Botvinnik decided to sacrifice the exchange. He played rook b4. Instead of rook b4, however, in his annotations, he writes that it would be much stronger to play bishop takes d5. And after e takes d is very bad because of queen f6, with attacking the h4 and also threatening e4, on which white has queen and the rook, and the bishop would be very strong. Or instead of e takes f, rook takes d5 would be much better. Then just rook b4 now, attacking the pawn on e4. So materially position is equal, and white has difficulties in defending the pawn. So in this position, Botvinnik writes that black would have chances to fight for victory. But after rook b4 immediately sacrificing the exchange, this move is also good, but only for a draw, to make a draw. It doesn't give any chances to black to fight for victory. So Bronstein accepts the sacrifice and captures the rook with a knight. Instead of this, rook takes b3 leads to immediate draw. After rook takes, bishop takes d5, e takes d, and now black has queen a4. And after rook takes b7, perpetual check. and a draw. That's why knight takes b4, rook takes b4. And now for the exchange, black has a compensation. e4 would fall, and black will have some activity. As after e4 falls, h4 would be weak, and white's king would be in danger. And now we can see why h3 was much better than h4. If the pawn was on h3, white wouldn't have all these problems. Rook d6, attacking the queen. Bronstein writes that it would be better first to play bishop f2, protecting the pawn, and only then rook d6. However, he played rook d6, queen takes e4. Now black is threatening to capture on h4, that's why bishop f2, queen f4 check, bishop g3, queen f5. And here Bronstein makes a mistake. He plays just automatically rook f3, attacking the queen. However, it would be much better to play rook b6 instead of it. Both Botvinnik and Bronstein agree that rook b6 would give white winning chances. So if black captures, then the pawn would be very dangerous on b6, threatening just to advance. That's why queen g4, defending the rook, and after rook takes b4, rook takes b4, rook c1, white has all chances to fight for victory. However, Bronstein played rook f3, attacking the queen. Queen g4, and now c6, so the pawn is advancing. Here, this c6 move was also a trap by Bronstein. If black made a natural-looking move e4, attacking the queen and advancing a pawn, attacking also the rook, that would lose on the spot because of rook d7, pinning the bishop and threatening just to checkmate on g7. And after bishop takes d7, another rook would do the same, pin the bishop, and there is no way black can defend g7, and white would win in this case. That's why after c6, Botvinnik played g5. He found another active resource for counterattack. If Bronstein captured on g5, that would be bad, because now e4 works, because the same variation doesn't work here. Rook d7, bishop takes d7, rook f7, and now black has defense. Queen h5 check. Now that the h file is open, queen h5 is check, and then white is losing the rook. So after g5, that's why Bronstein played c7, advancing even further. Now again e4 doesn't work, because after e4, rook d7, bishop takes d7, rook f7, it seems at first sight that by playing g takes h, black defends the bishop on g7 and creates threats on g3, but just by playing bishop e5, white saves the bishop and attacks g7 for the third time. And the catastrophe on g7 is inevitable, and white is winning in this case. That's why after c7, Botvinnik didn't play e4 and played rook c4, taking under control the pawn and just attacking it and threatening to capture it. Bronstein captured on b3. And now e4, attacking the queen. If rook b7, then Botvinnik, of course, prepared not bishop takes b2, because that's losing on the spot after promotion to the queen and check, but he had a very strong move, bishop c8, blocking the pawn and attacking both the rook and the queen. That's why after e4, Bronstein played queen f2. Now g takes h. Of course, white cannot capture on h4 because of bishop e5 check, and white is losing the rook. So the bishop must stay on this diagonal, so bishop f4. And now rook takes c7. And here Bronstein captured on e6 and returned the exchange. Rook takes e6. Botvinnik, in his annotations, writes that Bronstein made this move fearing new surprises. White forces a draw. So, in order to force a draw, Bronstein captured on e6, and after queen takes e6, bishop takes c7, queen takes b3, queen f5 check, and king g8, they agreed to a draw. So hit the like button and subscribe to make your contribution into the channel growth, and see you in the analysis of the third game.